Late at night, sharp knocking woke me, my son Dario's voice through the door. "Mama, we need to talk," and when he opened it before I could answer, his face pale like he'd rehearsed something unpleasant, he said, "You'll have to move into the back room. Lydia's parents need the master bedroom, it's just temporary." And I stared at him, searching for hesitation, but found none, because that master bedroom was where Diego and I slept for 25 years, where I sat beside him through his illness, where I held his hand when he took his last breath. And now my own son was instructing me to vacate the heart of my home for strangers who'd moved in after Dario showed up just for a few months 3 years ago that became permanent. After he remarried and Lydia rearranged my kitchen like she'd always lived there. After her parents Hector and Marble lost their condo and arrived with 2 suitcases that became boxes that became them, criticizing my cooking. Perhaps less chili, it upsets Hector's stomach. Turning off my air conditioner in Santa Fe summer heat, complaining my TV was too loud. And now demanding my bedroom where my husband died, while telling my grandchildren wouldn't Abuela be generous if she let us use her room, making me the villain for not surrendering 25 years of memories. If you want to know how a 68-year-old widow who'd been erased in her own home told memories don't require square footage, they're just memories, called a realtor the next morning. Got 3 cash offers by afternoon, highest $152,000, and the following week put the phone on speaker during breakfast so everyone could hear her accept the offer. Then looked at her son and said, "You forced me from my room, now you'll all leave this house, it's no longer ours. By next week it will belong to someone who respects what it means to have a home." Hit that subscribe button right now, because this is about learning that temporary is a weapon people use to slowly take everything from you. That being treated like a tenant in your own home means it's time to stop being the landlord. And that sometimes the only way to reclaim your dignity is to sell the walls that trapped you and walk away with nothing but 2 suitcases, and the knowledge that at 68 you still have the power to choose yourself over people who decided your comfort matters least. I'm from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Where are you watching from? My name is Isela. I'm 68 years old, though when this story began I was 65, 3 years into what I thought would be a temporary arrangement. I live in Santa Fe in an adobe house with thick walls and cottonwood trees in the courtyard. Or I did. That house isn't mine anymore, but I'm getting ahead of myself. After Diego died, I lived alone in those adobe walls for nearly 3 years. The silence then had been heavy but honest. Each creak of the floorboards, each shadow of the cottonwoods in the yard reminded me of him. I'd learned to live with grief, to let the emptiness shape a slower rhythm to my days. Then Dario showed up at my door with 2 suitcases, Mateo clinging to his arm and Lucia trailing behind. The divorce had worn him thin, his voice trembling as he asked if they could stay for just a few months. He said he needed time to get settled, to find a place he could afford while caring for the children. I opened the door without hesitation. Family doesn't turn family away. The first months carried a kind of comfort. The sound of children's laughter filled the courtyard again. Dinners around the long wooden table felt like a revival. I told myself Diego would have wanted me to help, but the months stretched. A year passed, then another. Each time I asked Dario if he'd found a new apartment, he would smile faintly and say, "Soon, Mama." Just until things stabilize. His soon became a blanket that covered every excuse. The boxes that had once been stacked in the hallway disappeared, replaced by school backpacks and shoes once Lydia entered their lives. The guest room became theirs, and the house that had been my refuge turned into a shared space where my voice held less weight. I tried to remind myself it was still temporary, though the word had begun to taste bitter on my tongue. By the time Dario remarried, I'd already surrendered the idea that my house would ever be only mine again. Lydia entered with a polished smile and a tidy order that unsettled me. She was quick to take over the kitchen, rearranging drawers and shelves as if she'd always lived there. Still, I held my tongue. Dario seemed lighter with her, and the children were eager for stability. I told myself I could accept change for their sake. What I hadn't expected was that Lydia came with her own burdens. Her parents, Hector and Marble, had lived in Albuquerque their entire lives. Hector had been a bank officer before retirement, and Marble prided herself on keeping a perfect household. But a bad real estate deal stripped them of the condo they'd downsized into. Legal troubles, Lydia said. Left them without a roof. It was a Saturday afternoon when they first arrived, their sedan packed with boxes and 2 rolling suitcases. Lydia kissed me on the cheek and whispered, "Mama, it's just until they recover. They've had such a hard time." Dario stood behind her, avoiding my eyes as if he already knew what I would think. I watched Hector struggle with the heavier bag, his posture stiff but still proud. Marble surveyed the courtyard, noting the cracked adobe plaster as if she'd already decided on repairs. Their presence was introduced as temporary as always, but I felt the shift before a single box was opened. The house had reached a new weight, and I sensed it would never return to what it once was. At first, Hector and Marble kept to themselves. They spent mornings unpacking, afternoons walking slowly around the courtyard, evenings speaking quietly in the guest room. I almost let myself believe it would be manageable, but like water dripping against stone, small intrusions began to wear through the walls of my patience. It started at the dinner table. Marble would glance at the pot and smile too sweetly before suggesting, "Perhaps less chili next time, Isela. It upsets Hector's stomach." Soon she offered to season the food herself, claiming it was easier for everyone. I had cooked in this kitchen for over 40 years, feeding Diego, my children, and half the neighbors who dropped by during fiestas. Yet suddenly, my food was questioned as though I'd never learned the balance of salt and heat. Then came the air conditioner. Santa Fe summers grow fierce, and I'd always allowed the cool hum to run in the afternoons. But Hector complained about the cost, about drafts making Marble's joints ache. Dario, eager to avoid conflict, suggested I adjust the thermostat. From then on, I found myself sweating through the heat of the day in my own living room while the guests rested comfortably. Nights were no better. I liked to watch the late news, the voices from Albuquerque keeping me company in the quiet. But Marble tapped on my door one evening, whispering that the volume disturbed her rest. I lowered it, then lowered it again until I sat straining to hear, holding the remote like a trespasser with stolen property. The house where I'd once laughed with Diego, where children had run barefoot across cool adobe floors, now felt like rented space. Each habit I surrendered seemed to signal that I was less the owner and more the tolerated occupant. When I caught sight of myself in the mirror one morning, I realized my shoulders were bent, my steps softened as if I were shrinking to make room for others. I was still paying the taxes, still keeping the lights on, yet every day I felt more like a tenant asking permission. And then, as if the small humiliations weren't enough, came the suggestion that struck at the very center of my life. One warm afternoon, I overheard Marble speaking softly to Lydia in the kitchen. "The guest room is too small for us, Mija. Hector can hardly stretch without bumping into the dresser. My poor husband wakes every morning with his back aching. Why not let us move into the master suite? It would be more fitting." Her voice carried just enough to reach me in the hall. I froze, the words tightening around my chest. My master suite, the room where Diego and I had lived half our marriage, where we whispered in the dark about our children's futures, where he'd breathed his last as I held his hand. Every wall carried him. To imagine strangers laying claim to it felt like a theft deeper than anything material. Later that evening, Dario approached me, his expression uneasy. He sat across from me at the table, fingers drumming. "Mama," he began. "They think it might be better if they had your room. It's larger, has its own bath, you'd be more comfortable in the back." The way he said it, gentle, as if offering me a favor, burned worse than anger. "That is my room, Dario," I answered quietly. "It's where I lived with your father, where he died. Do you understand what you're asking me to give up?" He sighed, looking everywhere but at me. "I know it's important to you, Mama. But they're older, they need more space. Memories don't require square footage. They're just memories, you can carry them anywhere. Just memories." As if 25 years of love, of hardship, of goodnight prayers and morning light through those windows could be reduced to something weightless, disposable. I pushed back my chair, stood, and left the table without another word. Behind me, I heard Lydia murmur, "It would only be temporary." Temporary? The same word that had hollowed out my house piece by piece. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, tracing my hand along the carved headboard Diego had built, feeling every groove beneath my fingers. I promised myself I wouldn't surrender this space. But promises, I was beginning to learn, meant little when others had already decided your life for you. It didn't take long before the conversations moved from whispers in the kitchen to open discussions at the dinner table. One evening, while we sat over bowls of caldo, Marble leaned toward Mateo and Lucia with a sweet smile that masked her intent. "Wouldn't your abuela be so generous if she let us use her room?" she asked, as though it were a game. Lucia looked up, spoon frozen halfway to her mouth. "But that's Grandma's room," she said softly. Mateo, older and beginning to mirror his father's hesitations, shifted uncomfortably. "I guess it would be generous," he answered, uncertain. I felt the blood rise in my cheeks. They were pulling my grandchildren into it, weaving them into a narrative where I was cast as selfish if I resisted. I kept my eyes on my plate, but every word clanged in my ears. Lydia chuckled lightly, brushing Marble's hand. "See, Mama, even the kids understand." The food turned to dust in my mouth. I excused myself, retreating to my room with the familiar weight pressing down on me. That night, after pacing the length of the room again and again, I picked up the phone and called my sister in Taos. "Letitia," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to hold steady, "they're trying to take my room. And now they're asking the children to agree with them." She listened quietly, then answered with the bluntness only a sister could give. "Sella, you're being treated like a tenant, worse, like an obstacle. They've decided your comfort matters least." Her words pierced through me. I knew she was right, but hearing it said aloud made the truth impossible to ignore. "Set limits, Hermanita," she urged. "If you don't, they'll never stop. You have every right to that room, to that house. Don't let them erase you." When I hung up, I sat in the dim light, staring at the familiar outlines of furniture Diego and I had chosen together. The silence pressed close, but beneath it something colder stirred, an understanding that silence would no longer protect me. The next morning, I would find out just how far they were willing to push. The following morning, Dario knocked on my door again, but this time he didn't hesitate. He stepped in with Lydia close behind, her arms crossed, her tone brisk. "Mama," Dario began, "we've talked it over. It's time you moved into the back room today. It's the most practical solution." The words struck with the coldness of a decree. Practical for whom? Certainly not for me. That room was little more than a storage space filled with boxes of Diego's old canvases and furniture too worn to use. The single window looked onto a wall, and in winter the draft froze everything inside. I opened my mouth to protest, but Lydia's voice cut in, smooth and decisive. "It will be quieter for you, Isella. The children won't disturb you, and my parents will finally have the space they need. It's best for everyone but me." I looked at Dario, searching for any flicker of doubt, but his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. He nodded, almost apologetically, as if convinced his silence was an act of kindness. My hands gripped the arm of the chair beside me, the grain of the wood grounding me against the tide rising in my chest. This was no request, no invitation to compromise, it was a verdict. My son and his wife had already decided, and my role was simply to comply. I felt myself shrinking in that moment, reduced to an obstacle they needed to move out of the way. Years of sacrifice, years of care, all distilled into a single order: give up your room. I didn't argue, not then. I only nodded once, the motion small, almost invisible. But inside me, something shifted. Their command had snapped the last thread of illusion. I understood now, with startling clarity, that in their eyes my needs no longer mattered. And when your place in your own home is erased, the only choice left is to decide how you will claim it back. I spent the rest of that day moving slowly through the house, but not into the back room as they expected. I touched the walls of the hallway, the framed photos of family gatherings, the worn edges of furniture Diego had carved with his own hands. Each detail reminded me of the years I'd carried this house alone and of how little that sacrifice meant now. When night fell, I sat at the kitchen table, the phone in front of me. I thought of Letitia's words. "You're being treated like a tenant." And I realized tenants at least had leases. What I had now was nothing. My thumb hovered, then pressed the number of a realtor I'd met years ago at a school fundraiser. "Senora Marquez," he said warmly, surprised to hear from me. "What can I do for you?" "I need to sell my house," I answered. My voice was calm, steadier than I felt. "And I need it done quickly." He hesitated. "We can list it immediately, but you'll have to accept a lower price if you want it fast." "I understand," I said. "Come tomorrow." When I hung up, a quiet settled over me, not peace but something firmer, like resolve. I pulled 2 suitcases from the closet and began to pack. Not clothes first, but the things that mattered, the photograph of Diego and me at the Santa Fe Plaza the summer before he died, his letters folded into worn envelopes. The sketches he'd drawn of our courtyard, the rosary his mother had given me when we married. By the time dawn broke, both suitcases stood by my door, zipped and ready. I looked at them and knew that everything I truly needed could be carried in my hands. And when the realtor's car pulled into the driveway later that day, I realized the decision was no longer a thought but an action, one that would change everything under this roof. The next morning, I set the suitcases near the front door. No one noticed. They were too busy in the kitchen, Lydia stirring eggs, Marble pouring coffee, Hector unfolding the newspaper as though it were his own table. I sat quietly waiting for the call I knew would come. The phone rang just after 8. I answered, placing it on speaker so everyone could hear. Señora Marquez, the realtor's voice was crisp, professional. We already have 3 offers, all in cash, one for $145, another for $148, and the highest at $152. Each is ready to close this week. The clatter of silverware stilled. Lydia's hand froze on the pan. Dario looked up sharply, Marble's mouth hung open. "I'll take the highest," I said, my voice steady. "Prepare the papers." The silence in the room grew heavy as though the adobe walls themselves held their breath. Finally, Dario spoke, his words broken. "Mama, what are you saying?" I looked at him, then at all of them. "You forced me from my room, now you'll all leave this house, it's no longer ours. By next week, it will belong to someone who respects what it means to have a home." Marble gasped. Hector muttered something under his breath. Lydia turned pale. Dario pressed his hands flat on the table, searching for words but finding none. I rose, my chair scraping across the floor. "I gave you space, I gave you time, and still you pushed me aside. You thought I would remain silent. Instead, I chose differently." No one spoke as I walked past them, the phone still glowing on the table, its quiet hum a witness to the choice already made. And with that choice, I had only one step left to take, finding where I would begin again. By the end of the week, the house was no longer mine. The papers were signed in a quiet office near the plaza. My name lifted from the deed as if 40 years of history could be erased with a pen. I handed over the keys without trembling. What mattered had already been packed into 2 suitcases waiting by my side. I moved into a small apartment downtown, just off the plaza where the streets fill with vendors and the sound of guitars drifts in the evenings. The place held only 2 rooms and a balcony, but light spilled through tall windows each morning, painting the adobe walls gold. For the first time in years, I woke without listening for footsteps outside my door. At night, I sat by the window with Diego's sketches propped against the sill, the city humming softly below. The silence here was different than the silence after his death. Then it had been heavy with absence. Now it was clean, uncluttered, chosen. Dario began calling each week. Sometimes it was his voice alone, sometimes Lydia's in the background, sometimes the children. I listened, I answered, but I kept the distance I had earned. Trust once fractured is not repaired with promises. I looked around my new space and felt no regret. The house had been walls, but this apartment was proof of something greater. That even at 68 I could claim what was mine. Better to live alone with dignity than surrounded without respect. That was the inheritance I wanted to leave behind, not land or furniture, but the courage to guard one's place in the world. And with that truth, I finally felt at home. Share your story with us. If your adult child moved in temporarily and 3 years later you're still waiting for them to leave, if in-laws have taken over your kitchen criticizing your cooking that fed a family for 40 years, if someone has told you memories don't require square footage about the room where your spouse died, if you've been asked to move to a storage room in your own house while strangers take your master bedroom, if family has used your grandchildren to make you seem selfish for not surrendering everything you have, if you've slowly been erased in your own home until you felt like a tenant asking permission to exist, know this. Temporary is a word people use to take what's yours piece by piece. Being treated like an obstacle in your own house means it's time to stop being the host. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is put the phone on speaker and let them hear you accept an offer that makes them all leave. You don't owe anyone your master bedroom just because they decided they deserve it more. You don't owe anyone the space where your memories live just because they think memories are weightless. And you don't owe anyone your home just because they're family. At 68, at 70, at 80, you still have the power to choose dignity over displacement. Better to live in 2 rooms with respect than in 10 rooms as a tolerated burden. Choose yourself. Sell the walls if you have to. Walk away with your 2 suitcases. Because some prisons look like family homes, and sometimes freedom looks like a small apartment where the only voice that matters is your own.